for democracy. And to evaluate the prospects for democracy, we have to, first of all, carry out some kind of assessment of where the world is heading. That's the prospects part. And crucially, we have to decide what we mean by democracy, which is a term that is used in a wide variety of ways. If we look at the present scene, we find an apparent clash between doctrines that are widely and in fact proudly proclaimed and social and political realities that appear to conflict with them very sharply. The leading doctrine is that the wave of the future is democracy and markets, a future for which America is the gatekeeper and the model. I happen to be quoting from the New York Times, but if you sample almost at random, you'll hear the same thing, more or less the same words. That's the doctrine. The reality is that the world, including our own society, is moving towards a more autocratic and absolutist structure. The scope of the public arena is narrowing, and the opportunities for popular participation in it are also declining. In short, the realities are that democracy is under attack. There are also parallel attacks on free markets, and there are expanding forms of market distortion. It's an interesting topic, but not tonight's topic, so I'll put it aside and keep to the question of democracy, the other half of the story. Well, I said that the doctrine and the realities are apparently in conflict. That is, the doctrine that the wave of the future is democracy and we're the gatekeeper and the model, and the reality, which I think is rather the opposite. Also, there's at least an apparent conflict, but in fact the conflict can be resolved, namely by attenuating the concept of democracy and reducing it to pretty much an empty shell, to various forms with little meaning. And I think that that's exactly what is happening. Of course, in that case, the doctrine will be true, and I think if we look, that's pretty much what we see. The same is true of the talk about markets, but again, I'll put that aside. Well, the currently prevailing concepts of democracy, which have been narrowing and becoming more restricted and impoverished over the years, democracy and liberty as well, these concepts would, I think, have utterly appalled someone like, say, Thomas Jefferson and other great figures of classical liberalism, for whom, incidentally, democracy and even liberty were part of something broader. They were part of the conception of a good society, which would be measured and evaluated by how well it freed individuals and their creative powers. It's to that end that democracy was considered an appropriate means. If we turn to a more modern period, I think that the currently prevailing and increasingly narrowing concepts of democracy would also have appalled contemporary thinkers, 20th century thinkers. For example, strike a crucial example is John Dewey, who was the greatest American social philosopher, and whose thought focused primarily on the problem of enriching democracy, which he understood pretty much in the classical sense. He incidentally was appalled by the narrowing of the scope of meaningful democracy, both in practice and in the rising democratic theories of his era, mainly the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the Wilsonian intellectuals who developed the progressive intellectuals of the Wilsonian period, who laid pretty much the basis for the modern form of the impoverishment and attenuation of democratic theory, helped out by the then rising fields of the academic political sciences. There's little doubt in my mind that Dewey, like Thomas Jefferson, would find today's scene, half a century later, even more ominous and depressing. Well, these are pretty important issues in contemporary intellectual history. They have very broad implications, and there's a reality beneath them that is even more portentous. These are very large topics. They're actually topics for an ongoing seminar, not for a talk. I'll try to say a few words about them, but they're going to be inadequate, I'm afraid. To begin with, notice that just about every society calls itself contemporary society, calls itself democratic. Actually, every contemporary society also calls itself egalitarian. The question is, equality of what? As is discussed in an interesting book by Harvard economist Amartya Sen that came out recently. So in our doctrinal system, we're supposed to insist upon equality of opportunities, one particular form of equality. Others call for other forms of equality. I stress our ideology. The reality is something else, as usual. Take, say, the old Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union consisted of countries that were called people's democracies, and in fact described themselves as the highest form of democracy. Well, we laugh at that for good reasons, and it's useful to have a look at the reasons. It's not that they didn't have elections. In fact, they did have elections. They could have even made the elections free, in the sense that anybody who wanted to could say, I'm a candidate, and could even be listed on the ballot. Nothing significant would have changed. The reasons were several. The primary reason was that the basic decisions, the most important decisions about how the society worked, were not in the public arena at all. So it didn't matter much who voted and who ran. The basic decisions were made by a military bureaucratic elite, including crucially decisions over the economy, decisions over what was invested and what was produced, and how commercial interactions and so on. In fact, the basic decisions are at the core of any society, surely any modern society. They were out of the public arena entirely. And that had a lot of consequences. One consequence was that information was quite narrowly controlled by the very same hands, namely by those who had the resources and the power to impose decisions on how they were used. Now, side comment, the population of the Soviet Union apparently had very wide access to information and used that access. There were interesting studies done by U.S. government-funded studies by American Russian research centers and others in the 1970s, who concluded that it appeared that about over three-quarters of the population was listening regularly to foreign broadcasts, and about 95% of the more or less educated sectors of the population. Samizdat, underground newspapers, technically illegal but all over the place, they were read by about half of the relatively educated part of the population and by about 15% of blue-collar workers, according to these studies. Those are phenomenal figures for dissident literature, incomparably beyond anything that we can imagine. Returning to the reasons why we laugh at Soviet people's democracies, another was that there was very little in the way of popular organizations that were able to function in the political sphere. Public participation in proposing or crafting, formulating public policy was extremely slight, and there weren't any organizational structures around that enabled people to take part in it. And finally, most people were so busy just trying to survive that they were unable to participate in any meaningful way in the public arena and wouldn't have been able to even if opportunities had existed. Under such conditions, democracy is at best a very thin reed. Well, you'll have noticed, I'm sure, that I'm describing our society. The basic point, the crucial point about the concentration of resources and decision-making power is not quite the same as in the Soviet Union. Basic decision-making here, too, is out of the public arena, in fact, entirely out of it, almost. But it's not in the hands of the military bureaucratic elite. It's in the hands of private power, corporations, financial institutions, and the like, which operate in secret without any public scrutiny, virtually any, essentially no public input. They're almost completely unaccountable. And in fact, they determine the basic things that happen in life. They're now increasingly transnational. As it's been the case over a long period that governing structures, things that become governments, tend to coalesce around concentrations of power in the last couple of centuries. That means primarily economic power. So national economies led to and were integrated with national governments. The increasing